Luke, you changed churches, man.
Kinda, but so did you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, we're at the same church, you and I, right? We've been part of the same church for a long time, and we still are. But I think what you're talking about is that we've changed our name.
Yes.
And so, yeah, it's been a big season of change in our church. We celebrate our 15th anniversary, but actually changed names. And it's been, in one hand, it's like, yeah, this is a different church. On the other hand, it's really not.
But there is a banner that says, same church, new name. And we did new service time. Well, let's just talk about change in general.
Great.
Hey, welcome back. Season 3, Preaching Through podcast. We almost weren't going to do a season 3. We had kind of talked about, I don't know, has it kind of run its course? Should we do something else? What are we going to talk about preaching through? And then I looked at the statistics and we doubled the number of listeners, which is great. Just knowing
amazing.
that
That's really cool.
It's getting out there. Our hope is that it would help.
Yeah.
Numbers aren't the only indicator, but they are a indicator, and every single number represents a person. So, hey, let's just keep doing it. And then on top of that, over the course of the last year, we've done several training days where we get together and do a live event and put out these training days on, here's how to run a Christmas offering. Here's how to schedule your work week as a pastor. We've done the preaching lab several times, and we've been active on X, formerly Twitter.
Dave, I'm just unwilling to call it X. It's still Twitter to me.
I can call it X, but I
can
still
change
want to
the name
call
of
it
my church,
tweets.
but I'm not changing the name of that social media.
Sorry, Elon.
Yeah.
But it's been encouraging to hear different people say, oh yeah, I've been listening to, Luke or the podcast or you guys on Preaching Through for a while. And, I really appreciate it. So season 3, here we are.
Yeah. I mean, I just think it's awesome for that people are listening, and hopefully this helps you. And if it does, I mean, share it with someone else that you think it might help. And I'm excited as we made the list of the topics to talk about this week. This season, we actually have more than we probably will even get to.
Yeah.
So it kind of went from like, man, if we kind of run the gamut to actually there's quite a lot to talk about.
Really just be one voice in the conversation of what it is to preach through whatever in 21st century America. God's word doesn't change. Who he is doesn't change. What it means doesn't change. But the culture and the context of how we deliver that message, that is constantly changing. And it would just be foolish to continue to approach this essential tool for leading a church with the same attitude that we had 10 years ago for 2 reasons. Number 1, because so much in the world has changed. And number 2, God is continually changing you and shaping your heart and growing you in different areas, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Which is why I think, it ends up being that this is a really relevant conversation today is, preaching through a big change. I don't know how many times you just use the word change or changing, but it's like if the world is changing and we're growing and changing, and we are trying to always be more effective, right? We don't want to change our message, but we do want to change our strategies. You kind of marry the mission, date the strategy. And so, just like you and I are going, hey, do we need to make a change as it relates to this podcast? Everyone in church ministry at some point is going to go, hey, we have a change. We have something we're going to do different. And navigating that and handling it well and leading it well and preaching is a part of how you're going to lead that. It becomes a really important conversation.
So this episode is navigating some of the things that you've encountered, some of the things that you had learned in the past and got to apply, and some of the things that you learned during this transition of going from a former church name to a new church name. Is there anything that you want to talk about prior to getting into, just where we'll start the conversation is change versus transition? Is there anything that you want to share or discuss, or any kind of like presuppositions you want to put out there?
Well, maybe it would just be helpful for some context for folks that maybe aren't as familiar with our church and what is changing. And so I'll just share a little bit about that. And then I'd like to, this is fresh, just going, okay, how do we preach through and lead through change? So essentially, we have been part of a multi-congregational church for the last 12 years. And that was one church with 10 congregations. Each church had a local lead pastor. Each congregation had local elders. But we did preaching together, and same name, same doctrine, a lot of stuff. And we've talked about that in the past. We would get together and do these preaching collectives and things like that. And as we've grown to 10 congregations in a number of, some of them hours away in different parts of Arizona, it just became clear over this past year that structure of being one church with 10 congregations wasn't serving all the congregations as well as we'd hoped. And so we made the change to go from one church, 10 congregations, to 10 distinct churches. Some of the churches changed their name. Some did not. We're all friends. We all like each other. I've been texting this week with some of the guys that were, part of that. But we're in the process this year of then the transition organizationally back end from kind of becoming our own entity. So that's a little bit of the context, a little bit of what's going on. And it's kind of an interesting thing in our case because like everybody loved the idea. It was just such a cool thing to go like, man, here's all these churches working together. And so there was some real loss around the idealism of that. On the other hand, we were operating so independently in most ways that a lot of people in our church kind of went, oh, I didn't actually think this didn't affect me that much. And so some of the changes we're going to lead through as pastors are going to affect everybody a lot. And some like this one are going to affect different people differently. We'll talk about that. So that's the context. That's the change I've most recently been leading through. I just don't want anyone listening to have to wonder like, what happened?
What actually happened? Yeah.
And so, so a lot of interesting stuff there.
Season 3, Preaching Through Podcast, episode 1, Preaching Through a Big Change. This should be a great episode because I'm interested in kind of hearing your thought process throughout the entire thing. And let's talk about it. Your first 200 sermons are going to be terrible. This is something the late Tim Keller once said, meaning that no matter how hard you study, how many hours you put in, or how much you work on your preaching, there's this glass ceiling that can only be broken with more reps. So, getting reps becomes your main way of growing as a preacher. But what happens when you surpass 200 sermons? What are you supposed to work on? Where should you try and grow, or what muscles are you going to need to build to have a faithful and fruitful preaching ministry over the long haul? Well, the Preaching Lab is a curriculum developed by our co-host Luke Simmons that fills this gap and takes preachers beyond what they've learned in seminary or Bible college. This live experience provides preachers with meaningful feedback, insight, and instruction so that they can improve their preaching for a faithful and fruitful preaching ministry. During this 12-week preaching cohort, preachers learn of minor adjustments to their sermon habits that have a major impact on the preaching moment. Tweaks that nobody in your congregation has the ability or the confidence to give you. It's a deep inspection of your routines, habits, study, and preaching, all so that you can become a better steward of the gift God has given you every single week, an audience. This is your opportunity to return the favor back to your congregation and preach a sermon that is faithful and fruitful. Visit faithfulandfruitful.com/lab to learn more about the Preaching Lab live cohort, as well as the Preaching Lab on-demand video curriculum. Now back to the podcast. All right, so the conversation really needs to start with defining the differences between change and transition, because those are two distinct things, but it's really easy to get them convoluted and think they are the same. How are they different? Why does it matter?
Essentially, the way I think about this is that a change is what's different when the transition is over. So it's really like the transition is the process to get to the change. And there's a really helpful book, Managing Transitions, or maybe it's Managing Leadership Transitions by Bridges. What's really helpful about it is he makes the point that people actually like change. What they don't like is transition. It's the process, right? Because transition is inherently, okay, you're leaving this previous normal, but the new normal's not quite here yet. You're in this, what he calls the neutral zone. And it's that process that is actually what makes change difficult. Now, when you think about it, all leadership is leading change, right? Leadership by definition is saying, okay, we're here, we should go there, and here's how we're going to get there. Well, if you're doing that, then you're just always, in a sense, leading change and leading transition. But there are these moments where, as an organization or as a church, you're saying, okay, here's a big new initiative, or here's a new name, or here's a new structure, or here's a new emphasis, or here's some new leadership, or here's some things that we're going to do in some different ways where it's big and it's bold and it affects a lot of people. And you have to go, okay, how are we going to lead this transition? And so when we even talk about preaching through a big change, what we have to realize is for the pastor, for the leadership, by the time you're getting to the point of preaching about it and talking about it, you're in a sense kind of toward the end of that process. You've gone through a lot of transition in your own conversation, in your own heart, in your own processing. And so when it's like, okay, we get to finally tell everybody about it, it feels to the preacher like the finish line. And we just want to say up front, no. It's actually the starting line. It's the starting point. It's the beginning of the transition that other people are going to experience. And Dave, I'd be curious your perspective on this, in this particular change, because you and I are, close and buddies. You knew more about this coming up than most people sitting in the church, right? The day we talked about this, you weren't sitting there going, whoa, I didn't know about this. You knew. But even so, you haven't been in all the conversations that I've been in and that our elders have been in. And so I'm curious for you, kind of the how you think about that, that neutral zone that, you're just sitting there in a church and you trust these leaders and these leaders, but they've all of a sudden thrust you into a transition that you didn't ask for and you didn't necessarily see coming. What's that like?
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is, what does this mean for me? Like immediately I think, how does this affect me? And I think if I had gone through this particular one, like I had gone through the past where it was just on that Sunday at the end of the year when you shared this news, I think immediately the consequences would have felt a lot bigger in the moment, just like they have in the past, than they actually were. So getting to spend time with you in the months leading up to it, it really felt more like a lot of wow and less of how. I think John Acuff is the first person I heard that from. It's funny. That language really helped clarify conversation and communication with me and my wife, because I would come home with all these big ideas and things that I want to try and new business ventures, and it would just overwhelm her because she's like, oh, okay, we're trying to get one thing launched and you've got 10 more ideas here. And then when we heard the language of the wow and the how, I'm the wow. And what she has to realize is, look, I'm just talking out loud here. Am I actually going to do these? Probably not.
Yeah. So if she responds with, Dave, how are you going to do that? It's going to be discouraging.
Incredible.
Whereas if she just goes, wow, Dave, that sounds so cool, then you'll feel encouraged, and chances are all your ideas are going to, they'll filter themselves out.
Yeah.
But yeah, that is a big difference. And, but what she's, and any spouse in that situation, what they're doing is going, wow, what does this mean for me?
Yeah.
Right. It is this, does this create, what does this create? And, most people aren't going to naturally respond with wow.
Right.
They're going to respond with how, or worse, oh no.
Yeah.
Or who cares? And then there will always be some that are like, oh wow, that's great, right? I mean, this is what's so interesting is, as leaders, we lead change and not everybody's super geeked about it right out of the gate. And we get discouraged. And it's like, if you actually look at the innovation adoption curve, I'm sure you're familiar with that, Dave, but it's essentially a bell curve of how quickly do people adapt to change, adapt to innovation, adapt to new technology. And what you have is there's always about 15% who are early adopters. There's always about 15% on the back end. They're never coming. It's never going to happen, right? It's
until Apple forces their device to shut down and they have to get a new device that runs the new operating system.
But probably they never got the Apple device in the first place, right? So, and then the rest is just a bell curve,
right?
Which means you can lead perfectly. You can do the very best job of communication and transition and all these sort of stuff. And by definition, half the people at the beginning are going to go, I don't know about this.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the journey of transition. And when we talk about preaching through a big change, what we're saying is, hey, this is kind of the kickoff of that transition season. And it will affect different people differently. And so here's what I've learned when it comes to these transition seasons. That you go in this neutral zone. You've left the old normal. You're not yet to the new normal. There's two things that people really need, and they actually need to experience both of these things when we're preaching about it. One is they need care, because they're losing what was familiar, right? Anytime there's a change, there's loss. Anytime there's loss, there's pain. Anytime there's loss and pain, there's grief, right? So there has to be a level of care and empathy and concern and just kind of going, yeah, like it used to be this, and man, that's tough. I mean, anytime people lose their preferences, lose what they were familiar with, sometimes depending on what the change is, it might mean they're going to lose some proximity to other people. I imagine like a change that a lot of people listening to this will go through is going from one service to two services. Mm-hmm. Well, it's like, oh man, I used to love how everybody was all together, and I used to see everybody, and I used to like that, or other changes that will happen. People will just lose stuff.
Well,
and you go like, you have to be caring. If you're uncaring about that, people will just go, well, I want to go back to Egypt. I want to go back to the old way it was.
A very stupid, comical, yet highly relevant illustration of this is when Chick-fil-A changed the barbecue sauce. For years,
I haven't heard about that.
I would not drink
you really
barbecue sauce.
You really like barbecue sauce.
I would get Chick-fil-A sandwich with their sweet barbecue sauce, and I would dip it in it. And one day I went, dipped it in, took a bite, and I was like, this is not the Chick-fil-A sandwich I know and love. And I looked at the front, and it was smoky barbecue.
Oh.
And so I went up and I asked, I said, can I get some of the original barbecue sauce? They said, this is the new barbecue sauce. And even though it seems so minor,
a little part of you died inside.
A little part. Well, I stopped eating their sandwiches because the Chick-fil-A sandwich to me was not the Chick-fil-A sandwich and something else. It was the Chick-fil-A sandwich with the barbecue sauce.
Everyone listening is like, Dave, don't you know about Chick-fil-A sauce? It's so much better.
There's actually another sauce. It's called honey roasted barbecue, and it does not come in the little plastic dipping cups. It only comes in like the ketchup packet type things. Sure. Ask for it next time. It's so good. But anyway. I was like, this completely changes the way that I experience this thing that I would often look forward to for lunch. It's completely changed the experience. And fortunately, Chick-fil-A cared enough to reinstate the barbecue sauce. And they said, we've got to get production back going, but in 5 months from now, we'll have the original barbecue sauce back.
Oh, so they went back to it.
Yeah. There was like change.org petitions.
Oh, wow.
There was hashtags on Twitter at the time. It actually became a pretty big deal for those who were in the know.
Yeah. Well, so one of the things that's interesting about that is like what Chick-fil-A experienced was resistance and sabotage, right? I'm not having any more Chick-fil-A sandwiches. And a lot of times that is what a lot of times, all the time.
Yeah.
When you lead, you actually don't know that anything's happening until you start to experience that resistance or that, the extreme form of it might feel like sabotage. And so leaders do get riled up and you're like, oh man, did I really blow it? What's interesting about that story is, they have, I guess, the opportunity to like kind of go back, and they probably now have multiple kinds of barbecue sauce.
3.
So they have 3. A lot of times though, in church leadership, you're not really going back.
Right.
It's like, okay, we're going from 1 service to 2, but I really wanted 1. Okay, but we're going from 1 service to 2. Like, you don't really, I
realize now my illustration doesn't necessarily help the...
Well, it makes a really great point though, because that is the temptation.
Yeah.
Because these people we love are upset about the change, or they don't love it, or they're not on board with it. And there is a temptation to go, well, okay, maybe we blew it. Maybe maybe you did. Right. And so like, I don't know the process Chick-fil-A went through that. And I don't know, like, and so it's okay as a leader to say, you know what, actually we made a mistake. But a lot of times what happens is we cave in, or we feel the pressure to cave into people's disappointment. And we don't, and what I want to say is we don't need to do that. We just need to show that we care. We say, hey, I get it. And a lot of times for me, what I want to do as a leader is actually share about how this is hard for me too. If you liked this, so did I. and we're all losing this. And so people need to experience care when they're going through these times of transition, because they are losing what was familiar, but they also need to experience vision, which is a picture of why it's still worth it, right? Like, okay, I know, man, that is hard. It's hard to not be able to see everybody in 1 service. It's hard to not be able to, feel like you kind of know everyone in a given week. But here we are called to reach people. And here we have an opportunity where God's bringing more people to our church, and God's saving more students in our ministry, and like, remember what we're about. And so there's care and there's vision casting. And both of those are important, because if you don't care, people will, experience that you don't care. And if you don't cast vision, then they'll think this is all for nothing. Mm-hmm. And they aren't going to be willing to make that journey. And so leaders, as we go through the whole period of transition, but especially on the front end, as we're communicating the change for the first time, we've got to have both care and vision.
One of the things that I hear you saying in there is reminds me of the tool that you produce that you go through with guys in the the preaching lab called the architecture tool. And in that architecture tool, do you remember what the points are in it real quick? It's like,
yeah, it's basically thinking through the what are the components of a sermon?
Yeah.
And so for almost every sermon point, you're going to typically have a statement of what the point is. There's some sort of explanation of what you mean. There's an illustration that helps it come to life. There's application to help you kind of say, here's how it applies. And then a lot of times in there, there's argumentation of here's like some logic and rationale and Bible and things that help you understand. It doesn't always have to be in that order, but yeah, those are the things that are usually part of that.
The argumentation, spending the majority of my last, 15 years in some level of communication, the argumentation seems to be, from my perspective, what gets lost in most messaging, whether it's a sermon, whether it's an email. It's this assumption that people are on board when they're really not, or it's this assumption that people understand things the same way you do when they really don't. And so the argumentation becomes all that more important to do exactly what you're talking about. It's essentially saying, here's why it's worth it. Here's what you can expect. Here's whatever the case might be. But that argumentation point, to me, I would hope that if somebody came to Ironwood Church and they sat underneath your preaching for an extended period of time, I would hope that they would be able to walk away and say, I really feel like Luke understands what it's like to be me, whether it's for this transition from sin to redemption, whether it's from conflict to reconciliation. I would really hope that they would walk away, because I think that's something that you do very well, is advocating and arguing for both sides of the conversation so that you can actually get someone to think like, okay, that does sound like my resistance, and I'm more open to hearing what he has to say because I feel like he understands me.
Well, and I heard years ago, I don't know where this quote originates, but someone said, given a lack of information, people will connect the dots in the most pathological way possible.
Yeah.
And so I just think when you're leading change and transition, like, don't leave gaps. And it's just better to be clear, and here's why, and here's what's going on, and here's the thought process. And I think people can deal with it if they go, yeah, I don't know if I like that, but I understand how you got there. They're more willing to do it. Here's the other thing that's really interesting, Dave, in that idea of transition. That same thing is true whether it's good news or bad news. So this is one of the things that we haven't necessarily delineated in this conversation yet. But when you talk about preaching through a big change, there's a little bit of an instinctive question of, is this a good change or a bad change? Right? It's kind of like when, I don't know if you ever have this as a dad, but there's times where I will tell my kids, hey, I need to talk to you about something, but I very quickly have to let them know if, like, hey, and this is serious, meaning like it's not good, or like, hey, it's no big deal. Like, I actually just texted my wife. I needed to talk to her about something, and I said, hey, everything's okay, but please call me ASAP. So sometimes you just have to, and there's moments where it's like, maybe it's not totally clear if this change is good or bad, but a lot of times, right? If it's like, hey, here's a big change. We're going from one service to two. We have an opportunity to buy a new building. Here's this great new ministry that we're going to start. Those are all feel like, oh, those are good changes. Bad changes are, hey, we need to talk to you about these few elders that are, stepping off of our board, or, hey, we need to let you know that this worship pastor is not going to be here anymore, or, whatever the case might be, so knowing what it is, obviously shapes and forms that. But either way, I think the principles we're going to talk about here really are applicable, whether it's good news, big change, or bad news, big change.
So the one question I have on this neutral zone, care, and vision component of the conversation underneath that change versus transition, before we get into some of these bullet points of actually doing it, do you have any insight on evaluating the concern or the reaction or the feedback that you've received during this process or others in the past of like, how do I categorize that? Is this just, emotion, or hey, that's actually a pretty good point. I hadn't thought about that. Do you have any insight for categorizing it? Because there might be that flinch of, we've thought about this for 9 months. We haven't, we're not going to change things. We're not going to go back just because you're having a bad reaction to, I am fallible. We did not see this coming, or we did not think about this. Any insight into that?
Yeah. I mean, I want to mostly hear and see how people are reacting, and then try to just see, is there anything here what should I notice? What should I learn? And I think we can get in a defensive posture that we want to try to avoid, where it's like, well, right out of the gate, I just got to prove to you why you shouldn't feel sad and you shouldn't feel upset. And we just and I think to go hey, people are going to react the way they're going to react. And there's going to be things we can learn from that. I mean, in this change that we're talking about now, when we got to the point where it's okay, I need to tell our whole staff, lots of people on the staff knew and even were involved in some of the conversations around the decision, but we have a large staff and not everybody was. One of the things I told them is listen, I'm communicating about this change to you, and this is the first time I've done it with anybody. Mm-hmm. And so actually, I'm going to ask that you give me some grace in how I do it, because I'm taking a couple runs at it. By the time I actually got to preach about it on a Sunday, I had lots of different reps, and I had gotten to experience lots of different people's responses and questions and emotions and the feel of it. And all of that helped shape it. And so I told him hey, would you give me some grace in this? But also I want you to know, you're going to help me be able to communicate this in the best way possible as we go through it. And so I do think that for a lot of changes, changes tend to go better when, especially people who, and this, now we're getting less into the preaching and more just the leadership, which is great. I love talking about that too. But one of the things I always think about with a big change is there are people in the church who a bunch of other folks are going to ask, what do you think about this? And it's really good if those people already know about it and have had some time to process it. Yeah. So before we had hey, let's talk about how, we're becoming Ironwood Church on a Sunday, a couple weeks before that, we had a members meeting, and a lot of our leaders are there and a lot of our key, volunteers and, the people who a lot of folks are going to go, what do you think? Well, if they've had 2 weeks to process it, then they're much more likely to go, well, here's why I think it's okay. And, and so that's part of the process too, is now sometimes you just don't have the luxury of that. Sometimes there's a big change and it's sudden and it's fast and it can't wait, and you just can't do anything about that. But if you have the option to stage it, then you actually get to learn from people's feedback and their responses and help that craft the way you lead going forward.
This actually, if you have not listened to the very first episode of Preaching Through podcast, we talk about preaching through a vision series. And so, Luke, you may or may not mention this throughout the rest of it, but was it a 2-week or a 3-week series that we did to talk about the vision of the change of the name?
Yeah, well, we did one Sunday that was an announcement of it.
Yeah.
And then we continued the series that we were in, which had another 4 or 5 weeks left. And then we did a 2-week series that was more casting vision for why this change was good.
So if you enjoy this episode and you find yourself kind of in the middle of this right now, I think you would enjoy going back to the very first episode, season 1, scroll all the way down on Apple Podcasts, click on the play. It's a really great episode. What we're going to get into now, we're going to pivot to what you want to keep in mind when communicating this big change. And one of the things I just want to remind people, just where you're coming from, Luke, is one of your ABCs is preaching, the assumptions, beliefs, and convictions about preaching. Preaching is the most significant tool for leading a local congregation. So now we're talking about preaching through this and communicating this change. That's what you believe, and that's why these things are important to you.
Yeah, and this is where it's going to just feel a little bit different. Not even a little bit. It's going to feel a lot different, because you're, and maybe this happens in some contexts, like this happens at your members meeting or something like that. But I think there are times when it's like, hey, we got to talk about this with everybody. And it's not going to feel like just a normal exposition of Romans 5. It's going to be like, hey, we're going to tie this into the Lord and to his word. And, I don't think you should preach a sermon and not have the Bible in it, but it really is more of like leading this moment. You might have some scripture that helps frame the moment, but chances are not chances are, I know there's no Bible verse that says thou shalt move to 2 services, right? So you're going to, at that point, go, okay, are there some scriptural things that have informed this change, that have informed this decision? And you might talk about those, but then mostly what you're going to be doing is just sharing the news and explaining it and answering questions and answering questions that you're anticipating. And so that's really what we want to talk about, is how do we communicate that well?
And so the first point is just acknowledge, and I think you do this well, acknowledge varying emotions.
Yeah, I think to just, I always think in leadership and in preaching, if you can name it and state the elephant in the room, that's really significant. So in this most recent change, I knew that there were largely going to be like 4 kinds of people. There were going to be guests, right? And I wanted to acknowledge that. Hey, if you're a guest with us today, man, I think a lot of times in these kind of weeks, preachers apologize and they go, well, I'm sorry, you came on a bad week. And I actually would say, I think what I said was, hey, if you're a guest, this is going to be different than what we normally do. But I actually think this is a great Sunday for you to be here, because you're going to get a sense of what really makes us tick and how we make decisions. So that's someone to acknowledge. Another person is I just said, hey, some of you, this is going to really impact you a lot. Like you care a lot about this multi-congregational structure we've been in, and this is going to be difficult for you. And then a third group of people is like, some of you are going to not really care about this at all. And it's going to be like, man, you spent a whole Sunday on this? I can't believe you would do that. And then I said, and then the people I think is going to be most affected by this are actually the people who have close friends and family at other congregations. And they're hearing about this today, and they're hearing about it from their leaders in different ways. And that's going to especially just feel like a loss, because it's felt cool to, even though we're at different congregations and you almost never go to their church and they almost never come to ours, it still feels like you're part of the same church.
That's one of the reasons why we came to Gateway in the beginning, is because we had been attending Redemption Tempe. We had some family connections, and we found out we had some, connections of, oh my gosh, we used to go to church together and you're here too. But the main reason was we loved Redemption Tempe.
And I think that will be one of the losses that we experience from this change there just is no doubt that for whatever you want to call it, the brand name of like having this multi-location thing with one name is like, that was a great thing. But I just told the people, like, listen, if you feel like I'm so close to these people at other places and this is going to be hard, me too. Some of my best friends in the world are highly involved in these other churches. So just acknowledging that and helping people be able to go, okay, like he understands, he gets this. He's not just running roughshod over this. I think sometimes we can just over rah it and, not acknowledge that this isn't always going to be everyone's favorite.
So the second one is flinch towards more vulnerability and not less. How does that play out?
I one of the things that I believe strongly is that everyone should always experience the real you, but not everyone should always experience the full you. And people will resist that sometimes. But to me, that's the difference between authenticity and vulnerability, right? Authenticity is you're always the same person everywhere. Vulnerability is, here's how much of me I'm going to let you in on. And I think in these moments of change, being more vulnerable about how this is affecting you, how you're processing this change, I think that's just helpful because, and kind of what I said earlier, with a lack of information, people connect the dots in the most pathological way possible. So more vulnerable, more information, more open. I think sometimes we go, well, I got to protect this, or I don't want to say the wrong thing. And it's like people end up connecting the dots in all these ways you didn't want, right? And so I think as much as possible, a lot of times, like I actually did this with our members when we were talking about this, is I said, now, here's what I know. There's going to be a bunch of you who are thinking, but what really happened? So actually turn to your neighbor and ask him, what really happened? And I said, let me tell you what really happened, right? And I laid it out. Now, that was in a members meeting. I had more time than I had on a Sunday. But similarly, even on the preaching moment, trying to be candid and forthright and hey, this is how this is affecting me. I just think, Craig Rochelle says people would rather follow a leader who's real than one who's always right. And I think it's an opportunity to be a real person and to, people will connect with that authenticity and that vulnerability and that information.
Then there is be crystal clear on what is changing.
I just think you've got to write this stuff down in very clear things, because otherwise people can go, so what was it? It's much more helpful to go, redemption is going from being one church with multiple locations to being 10 distinct churches. There it is. That's what's changing. Now, that's not the only thing that's changing, so maybe there's other things to say, but just being very clear, writing it down, putting it on the screen, making it where it's just undeniable what you're saying. Here's the change that's happening, because not everyone in your church will be there. Other people will hear about it. You're not just trying to help people understand what's going on, but you're actually equipping them with the language to be able to talk about it themselves. And so just the clearer you can be, the better.
I experienced that because we do have friends at other congregations. And one of the questions, I saw one of my friends just out and about town says, hey, can you tell me real quick, is Gateway leaving redemption? And I had exactly what you said. Well, in the past, it was 10 churches, or it was 10 congregations, one church. Really what it's becoming is 10 distinct churches. And I know that Gateway is changing their name. I think maybe a couple others are changing their name and a lot are keeping their name. But really, it's just going from 10 separate congregations. And I believe some will be networked together somehow. And okay.
Yeah.
But it was only because I had heard you say it so crystal clear that I was able to articulate it so crystal clear.
Yeah. Well, clarity is kindness.
Yeah.
And if it's, the old saying about preaching, if it's a mist in the pulpit, it's a fog in the pew, And so being as clear as you can about here's what's changing. And sometimes what that means is saying, here's what's not changing, right? Here's what isn't part of this. And that really gets into the next part, which is anticipating questions.
Well, before we get into that, anticipating questions, I do want to emphasize that I believe that because that clarity is kindness, you got to rehearse this stuff. And we've talked about that in past episodes. I even use the illustration that when I call my cell phone provider, I don't want to babble and ramble when I get on there. Hey, you called me, get to the punch. And so I know exactly what I'm going to say. I don't start with, I'm just calling because. I start with, here's why I'm calling. I see a charge on my bill and I wanted to get more clarity about it. Can you help me understand where this charge came from? I practice those. Practice. Get other people's feedback. You already alluded to it. Hey, I'm sharing this with you, our staff, for the very first time. Please give me some grace, but also you're going to help me learn how to articulate this more clearly. And practice, not just the big change, practice your main point in your sermon. Make sure that it comes across the way that you want it to come across, especially if it's a tough text, right? We've talked about in a past episode that there are tough texts that are culturally tough. There are, culturally tough?
Some are
theologically tough.
Yeah, theologically, just interpretively tough, emotionally.
And the more that the more a text coincides and intersects those, the more difficult the text. So practice this stuff ahead of time.
Sure.
Don't let the first time you're practicing it be on the people. So
yeah, that's really good advice, Dave. This is just not a moment you want to wing it.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, if half of them are already going to go, I don't know how I feel about this. And then you go, and they don't really understand it because you weren't clear. Well, it's just you're just digging your own hole.
And maybe you're going to be getting some questions that you could have answered on the front end. So anticipate questions and provide answers to build trust and make people feel safe and cared for.
Yeah, you just have to go, okay, here's what people are going to ask. Here's what they're thinking. You start this by just saying, here's what I would be thinking.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of times I like to say, hey, if I were you, here would be some of the questions I'd have on my mind. And boom, 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 boom. And you answer those. And it validates those questions. It's another way of acknowledging the various emotions and the various thoughts. And what was really helpful about the process going from, staff and other key leaders and then members is there was one question in particular that kept coming up that I didn't anticipate. well, by the time we got to the Sunday, I was able to go, oh, here's a question that you probably have, because that question had kept coming up. And so a lot of these questions you're going to anticipate, some of them you're not, and that's okay. But the more you can anticipate, it makes people feel like, okay, they know what they're doing here. Like I don't know if I love this decision, but I like them, and I know they've thought about it, and they're thinking about the problems and questions that I would have. So, okay, maybe I'll come around. And I'm telling you, chances are they will come around. But if you aren't thinking at all about the stuff they're thinking, then it just communicates to them like, gosh, they don't even, I don't know if they know where they're going. Like I'm not ready to follow someone that kind of feels like they're just wandering around here.
This stuff really, honestly, if this type of empathy and this type of forward thinking and really just trying to put yourself in the shoes of your congregation, like if that's not in you, you got to have people around you. Cause it would be tough for me to have a pastor that's not trying to think about how this affects me.
Well, and here's, I think where we mess it up is when we get insecure and we make it about us.
Uh-huh.
And so if you have to feel good about this right out of the gate because my self-worth is attached to you feeling good about this, then I'm going to sell it too hard and I'm going to not be able to enter into the, well, what about this? And I'm going to dismiss that. And the irony is in doing that, it's actually going to make you feel worse about it. And it's going to just create the thing I'm afraid of, which is being rejected. And so if you can get over that insecurity and really just try to love the people well, say, man, if I were them, here's what I would need. And you provide care and you provide vision.
So this goes into the why can't just be from your head, but it needs to be coming from your heart as well.
Yeah. I just think there is something about people connect with a leader's heart. And I don't mean it has to be emotional in the, like, you don't have to cry. That's, you can cry. That's fine. But people, if it feels like, oh, this was just a head decision, it's a little like, does this matter that much? And so I think, to the degree that it does connect with your heart, being open about that and sharing that, and otherwise it'll feel a bit detached and it'll feel a bit like just doesn't matter that much.
One of the things that happened 4 months before this change was announced, and we had a pastor who returned from sabbatical, and we gave a Sunday to allow that pastor to share, what did I learn on sabbatical? And there was something that you said, I believe, in introducing him that morning was, hey, we're doing this for a number of reasons. One reason is it's just practical to have him share what he learned in front of everyone so that he doesn't have to say it over and over. But I also think it's really important to allow him to share what's on his heart. And one of your, what's going on in the heart of your pastor, and what's going on in their lives beyond just what you see on a Sunday morning. And so I don't know that is a natural connection, but I am just saying, like, that seems like that was something that's been modeled multiple times. So it doesn't feel like this is a one-off event. Like, it's been modeled in multiple times before. So you could take it a little bit more seriously.
Yeah, and you got to know your flinch. Like, there are some people who they're going to lead with all heart, and it's going to border on manipulation.
Uh-huh.
And then there's other people who, the reality, this is where it was for me, is like I had gone through, in the months leading up to this, I'd gone through the acceptance of the change, the grief around it, the emotion around it. By the time I'm now communicating it, it's easy to communicate it very matter-of-factly, like it's just from my head, without. And then people who are maybe beginning to experience some of the pain and the grief feel a disconnect from me because it's like, well, I'm already over it.
Yeah.
And so for them to have a little bit of a window into that heart, I had to remind myself, people need to see that. And I need to give people a little window there.
That's what was different for me, being around you in the months leading up to it. I going back to what we talked about, I got to see a lot of the wow. I got to hear a lot of the wow. We could do this, we could do this, we could do this. I think it's important to have those relationships, any type of leader that you are, have those relationships where you can share the wow, knowing that it's going to stay in that room. And what you say right there doesn't get out to where it's like, well, I thought you said you were going to be doing this, or I thought we were doing that. No, just like dream together. Mm-hmm. But that morning when it got announced, I had some friends who said, I don't don't know how I feel about it. And I had to remind myself that, well, I've experienced this for about 9 months.
Yeah,
I'm 9 months ahead of them. And so rather than saying all of the reasons why this is a great deal, I was like, yeah, it is. It's some big news. And if it's unexpected, I think in a bit. So that's a good reminder. And then finally, they'll be shaped as much by how your presence felt as what you said. What do you mean by that?
Well, my counselor, who I started working with years ago when I took a sabbatical, he's just told me a million times, Luke, the biggest gift you give to your family, to your church, is your transformed and transforming presence. And there is a sense when you're leading change, you're initiating transition, you are unsettling people, and they're grasping for something to help them feel safe and to help them feel like this is going to be okay. And a lot of it, in a way that I don't fully understand, is like just how you feel to them. Like, how do you feel anxious? Do you feel settled? Do you feel some combination of connected and bold, or do you just feel aloof? Or like, what does it feel like? Because the way you feel is actually going to shape people's experience of this. And if it's like, boy, he just feels nervous, they'll remember that more than they'll remember the specifics of what you said in minute 17, So it really is a lot about your presence. The other thing that I think happens in change, and I told our staff this a lot related to this particular change, was that, I said, listen, what's in our hearts is going to come out, and people are going to sense it, and people are going to feel it. And so, we have to do the work to make sure that like we're bought in on what we're doing and how we feel about this, and in particular, in this case, how we feel about these other churches, because in our case, the situation is it's creating more distance from other people who we know and love. And if what's in our hearts is, oh, good, I wanted to be rid of those people, well, that'll come out. If what's in our hearts is, oh man, I really love them, and I'm so grateful for what God did with us together, but it's time for a new season, that'll come out. And I just think it's important that you pay attention to your heart and your presence and what's going on.
This conversation doesn't end here. If you are, anticipating making big changes, or you need to communicate a big change, just like this podcast is meant to be one voice to help you navigate what it is to preach Jesus through 21st century America, you can also reach out to us. If you send a message, luke@faithfulandfruitful.com, we're available. Luke is available to just think that through with you and provide you some options and even just give you some insight. And he's the documents guy. He may even have a document or something like that that he can share your way. But just know that the conversation doesn't have to end here. I hope that this has been a helpful discussion. I hope that you've got a few things that you can walk away with feeling like, okay, like I didn't know how I was going to handle this particular aspect of it. I've got some things that I can talk over with my leadership team now, and we can evaluate them together. Any final thoughts on this particular? It's a lot of heavy lifting. It's a lot of emotions connected, depending on what it is. Any final thoughts that you would share?
Dave, I think my last thought is really just that we have to get good at this, because this is what leadership is. Leadership is always leading change. And some weeks, like we've said, it's going to be, here's the big announcement. But in a sense, this is what's always going on, right? This is why in our preaching, we're always trying to love people and understand where they're at, understand where they're coming from, understand what they need to hear, understand the objections they have to what we're saying. It's why our leadership over time has to have a presence that feels like Jesus and that is settled and that is healthy. And so your ability to, what's fun is the more of these big moments you have and you actually start to do them well, the more it helps all the little moments of just normal leadership go well, and they actually reinforce each other. But leading is leading change. And so we've got to do our best to do this well.
I want to give a shout out to John. We got a really great, kind comment from John on X, formerly known as Twitter, just sharing his thoughts and how the podcast has encouraged him. So John, just want to say thank you for doing that. If you've got any thoughts you'd like to share, Luke is on X at Luke D. Simmons. You can find him. You can reach out to him. You can also follow at Faith Fruit Men, because Elon decided that we couldn't have one that's Faithful Fruitful Ministry, so we had to shorten it.
Well, and really the best thing is if you just go to faithfulandfruitful.com and you subscribe to our newsletter.
Yeah.
We've got, close to 3,500 pastors and leaders who are receiving those emails and just trying to have other ways of encouragement, we'd love to stay in touch that way.
Yeah. So you can reach out to us, and we'd love to hear what's going on with you. faithfulandfruitful.com. There is a newsletter subscription. Excited for season 3.
Yeah.
Before we hit the big giant record button, you put your hand on my shoulder, like, hey, I'm glad we're doing this together. This is fun. I agree. This is a lot of fun. And I'm really, really grateful that we decided to do season 3.
Yeah.
And we'll come back with episode 2.
See you then.